Hi, everybody. Today we are going to be talking about Notes 3.6, and this is all about third party politics. So, we've talked about the two major parties and their ideologies. This is going to be about third parties today, and largely looking at our objective, looking at how structural barriers like single member districts, winner take all voting, and the incorporation of third party agendas how those act as barriers to third party and independent candidate success. Right. So, why is it that we've never had an independent, or in a very, very long time, why we've never had an independent or third party candidate be successful? So, just as an overview of what third parties are also known as minor parties. And when we're looking at political parties, guys, remember that these are giving people with similar beliefs the opportunity to participate in politics. Third parties are no different. What is different about them is that they are smaller sized and they play a lesser role than the major political parties, right? When I'm talking about major political parties, I'm talking about your Democrats and Republicans. So these are smaller and they are less influential than your traditional parties. Now, why these form? The two major parties are going to compete to always win that majority, right? We have this two-party system that we'll talk about in a second. But these two parties occupy quite a bit of that ideological spectrum. Most voters will identify with one or two of, or sorry, not one or two, but one of these parties. Now, more ideological citizens may believe that neither of these parties hears or is implementing their desired agenda. And what we see happen is some of them may create their own party as a result. Now, there are a couple of types of third parties that we see form, right? So, depending on what the issue is or how the group feels like their policy goals are not being met, they might form a party in one of these three categories. The very first is ideological. And an ideological third party is a party that subscribes to a consistent ideology across multiple issues. And usually these ideological parties have the ideology in the name of them. So, for example, you have your libertarian party, right? If you look at that libertarian platform, you're going to look at and find libertarianism pretty consistently throughout that platform. The Socialist Party is also an example of an ideological third party. There are also single issue third parties, and that's basically what it sounds like. These are parties who campaign on one issue and one issue only. So, for example, you have the Marijuana Party, the Right to Life Party, the Green Party, right? Those are really campaigning for that single solitary issue, right? Marijuana would be the legalization of marijuana. Right to Life, focusing on anti abortion policies. The Green Party is still in existence and it's pretty prominent, but that is an environmental group largely. And then we have factional or splinter parties, and these parties form when members split and break off from a major party and they form a new one. One of the best known factional or splinter parties is the Progressive Bull Moose Party from the early 1900s. The Republican Party during this time period didn't nominate Teddy Roosevelt. He was upset by that and he decided to run anyway. And progressives kind of rallied around behind him and created this progressive bull moose party. So this was a split from the Republican Party of the time period. Now, traditionally, I don't know what's going on here. Traditionally, the United States has had a two party system that does discourage third party and independent candidates, especially at the national level. And there are a couple of reasons for this. Most people are going to identify with one of the major parties, right? At a broad scale, most people are going to find that they can say, yeah, I lean more Republican, or yeah, I lean more Democrat. So most people are going to identify with one of those. And this two-party system is also maintained through that party polarization that we talked about, right? We have this two-party system. Parties are more and more moving in opposite ends of the political spectrum. So, in order to win, their influence in government, parties and people have to align themselves with one party over another, right? There is less, or I should say, I guess there is more pressure to align with one of the major parties versus a third party. Now, there are structural barriers in place that have limited the impact and influence of third parties and independent candidates. So, just something to keep in mind, there has been no minor party winning the presidency since 1860. Arguably, that's Lincoln. Lincoln technically was a third party. Um, and really, these barriers that we talk about are going to make these minor parties have a difficult time competing with really that organization and well funded system that is the Republican and Democratic Party. Now, one of the barriers to third party success is money and exposure. And this really isn't structural. This is just something that kind of happens. This is a consequence of this two party system, but it's worth noting. So, third parties and independent candidates are at a disadvantage when it comes to financing and fundraising, as well as ballot access and exposure. When we're looking at financing and fundraising, I mean, plain and simple, Republicans and Democrats are more organized. Their party structures, they have those semi independent levels working at the national, state, and local. It's easier for them to raise money, convince donors to sponsor the party, and convince people of their ability to win, right? People want to donate to a winning campaign. And oftentimes, minor parties need to be self financed, which is very, very difficult to do because campaigns are very expensive. Minor parties also face the challenge of ballot access when you compare them to the other political and major political parties. It is harder for third party candidates to meet the state requirements. States set these methods for candidates to kind of earn a spot on the ballot. Usually that's a fee or a minimum number or a minimum number of signatures, like a petition, right? So we just talked about like financing is hard. So if it's a fee, that might be a little bit more difficult. But also gaining those signatures could be a challenge as well. Republicans and Democrats, I mean, think about it. They just have a stronger and already existing party network. It's a lot easier and faster for those major parties to go around and grab those signatures. So oftentimes, simply getting on the ballot to gain those votes is discouraging to many third party candidates. The media as well is going to pose a challenge to these third parties. The media tends to not cover minor party candidates. These independent candidates are rarely invited to debates or featured on televised forums at any level of government. Ads are expensive. And again, we talked about the impact of money here. So ultimately, because the media is not covering these minor party candidates, they don't receive the exposure to get noticed by enough proportion of the population. Now, one of the structural barriers to third party success is something called single member districts. And we also will call this a plurality system or first past the post. All three of those terms are kind of referring to the same thing. Now, in this system, there is one spot and one spot only. Okay, one person is elected for each position, and the candidate has to win the most votes or a plurality to win that office, right? They have to win the most. Now, typically, because of those things that we just looked at on the last slide, this is a member of a major party. They have the resources, they have the exposure to get them that plurality of votes. Now, in this system, part of the issue is there is no rewarding second or third place, right? A third party candidate might come in second or third place, but they don't win the majority, they don't get the seat. This is in contrast to something called proportional representation or proportional systems. And this is typically found in many European countries. And this is going to encourage and reward third parties a little bit more. This is where those parties are competing for office and voters cast votes for the party they favor. And this could be ranked even. And then after the election, those offices are filled proportionally. So, meaning the more votes a party gets, the more seats, all the way down to those last place finishers, even if it's just one seat, right? So, for example, if a party receives 20% of the votes cast in an election, in a proportional system or a proportional representation, they would be awarded 20% of the seats in government, still having that voice. We call this a coalition government. And we've kind of talked about coalitions, but this is where two or more parties are going to join to run the government. Another barrier to third party success is the fact that in our country, we have something called winner take all voting, especially at the Electoral College. Now, I know we haven't really covered the Electoral College yet. Guys, I'm sorry for all the glitches. I don't know what's happening here. But the Electoral College is what's going to determine the presidential candidate. Um, and the way that the Electoral College gets its direction to vote is from the popular vote, right? We as people will go out on election day and cast our ballots, and the electors will look at the popular vote to determine how they will cast their vote in the Electoral College. Now, all states except for two, Maine and Nebraska, are going to give all of their electoral votes to the candidate who wins the plurality of the popular vote. So, for example, in 2020, Ohio went to President Trump. So, we are a winner take all state. That means that since President Trump won the plurality of votes, our electoral votes will go to President Trump in the Electoral College, and so on and so forth. This is what we call that winner take all voting, right? You cannot split up those electoral votes based on proportion unless you are Maine and Nebraska. Now, winner take all voting is a barrier to third party success for two reasons. Ultimately, because third parties are smaller, they're not as funded, they don't have as large of a following, they can rarely win a state's popular vote, and therefore they don't get the plurality and they don't get enough of those electoral votes, right? They don't get the 270 that they need to win. And not only that, but independent voters are discouraged from voting third party because ultimately they feel like they're throwing away their vote or almost wasting it, right? It's like, I might as well have my vote go toward a party that's actually going to win. That kind of becomes the mentality. And then finally, we have the incorporation of third party agendas as a structural barrier here. Now, over our history, there have been 52 independent political parties, but none of them have gained any traction. Um, and part of that reason is because major parties will incorporate items from a third party agenda into their platform. So, this cartoon here, Nader was a very famous guy who was running as a third party candidate in the early 2000s, right? The Republican headquarters are jumping up and down because they know they can incorporate quite a bit of his platform and policy issues to gain his votes. Major parties are going to ultimately do this incorporation to attract third party candidate voters, right? Because if voters are thinking, well, I don't want to waste my vote, I don't want to throw it away, quote unquote, I want to give it to one of the major parties, I might as well give it to the major party that closely aligns with the third party. So that is a way that, this incorporation can create a barrier to third party success. This ultimately, yes, does discourage third parties, but this can also result in social change and positive social change. So, if you think about the early 1900s, some of the issues in our country were fighting for women's suffrage, labor laws, including child labor laws. So the Socialist Party was a third party, or is a third party. They were promoting those issues. They were promoting women's suffrage. They were promoting child labor and unionization. And that is now taken for granted by both parties. So, from the fact that the major parties incorporated that into their platform, that brought about some positive social change for many groups of people. Alrighty, folks, that is your notes on third party politics. Your goal was to explain how structural barriers like single member districts, winner take all voting, and the incorporation of third party agendas impact third party and independent candidate success. So make sure that you are focusing on those in the learning objective. And let me know if you guys have any questions. I will talk to you soon. See you later.